right behind me, next to me, wherever you want to go. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out today to talk about something very important for our nation's security. As you know, as the majority of Congress headed home last night for the weekend, and all eyes are turning towards pressing issues within the Beltway here, I want to today ensure that we focus again on what I believe is our nation's number one priority, and hopefully, by definition, the number one priority of members of Congress as well, and that's our troops in the U.S. military and the national security that they deliver to us on a daily basis, especially relative today to this very strong and dangerous peer threat in the form of China. I specifically want to talk about the imperative of passing this year's defense spending bill as proposed by Republicans in the House Appropriations Committee for Defense. But before I get into the need and value of this bill, I want to thank my fellow members of Congress here today who have stuck around, former veterans who choose to stand here today and always will for our troops. I'm joined by a few colleagues who have served in the past in uniform for decades for this beautiful nation and chose to be here today to do the same. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. I'm also joined by the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee for Appropriations, Mr. Ken Calvert, who will speak here shortly. And it's his leadership that has helped us get this very historic DoD bill through committee and will actually change the trajectory of our readiness levels here in the U.S. military shortly. So I want to thank you guys for joining us today. And the bottom line is we want our troops to know that the majority of members in Congress, in both the House and Senate, are actually on your side, and we're going to be fighting like hell to make sure that we take care of you. This isn't a partisan issue, and this certainly isn't a political issue, at least it shouldn't be, and that's the point. We need to take care of our troops regardless of our personal political agendas, and at this point in our nation's history, we need a win for our troops. On the heels of the Afghanistan debacle, and in the midst of some of the worst recruiting and retention metrics that our nation has seen in recent history, House Republicans are literally the only people standing between our troops and this extremely weak executive branch that seems hell-bent on driving military readiness, morale, and capacity into the ground. Today, to give you an example, the Army and the Navy are both missing their recruiting numbers by about 25%. 25% below their targets, and that's after they've already lowered their expectations. So this proposed Republican defense bill that we address today is actually the first DoD package in several years that actually reverses that trajectory of decline of our military and the decline of our nation's standing on the global stage. With this bill, we finally start to appropriate and appropriately invest in our troops, invest in industrial production capacity, and we ensure that we're spending money on matters that actually go towards funding the mission of the military and not issues and pet projects that actually dilute the mission of the military. And just to remind you and our fellow Americans what the mission of the military is, it's actually pretty simple. The mission of the military is to deter war. And if unable to deter war, win the war with absolute and crushing fury of power projection that's overlaid with exotic and unmatched technologies, that is underpinned by the unbeatable passion, professionalism, and patriotism of a warfighter who dearly loves his country and is willing to give his life in defense of that country. And while he's willing to die for his country, we need to, in Congress and in the executive branch, hopefully, also make sure that he doesn't die in war and that he comes home with valor because we gave them the tools and the unfair advantage that he deserves on the battlefield. And today we have a large bear just outside of our tent in the form of China and the CCP regime. We need to establish a meaningful offset against this threat before it's too late. This defense package is a critical step to do just that. China's not a near-peer threat, folks. They are, in fact, a peer threat, and in some domains they're actually outpacing us, and they continue to accelerate away from us. And just this week, Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall, who's a a man that I have great respect for, reminded us that China is in fact preparing to go to war, and they are in fact preparing to go to war with the United States. This threat is real, it's imminent, and we cannot let our weaknesses put our troops in harm's way. And what are those weaknesses? I think our biggest weaknesses are our industrial base and our production capacities that we can't keep pace with China with. I think our biggest weaknesses are in the White House and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And here on the Hill, I think our biggest weakness is a susceptibility and vulnerability of being too easily distracted by political drama and gamemanship that compels us to do horse trading with a precious piece of legislation like this defense spending bill. It's for this reason that we stand here today to implore all Republicans and Democrats to support this very important $826 billion critical step forward. Now, you may have issues with federal spending levels outside of other agencies. They might be too high, they might be too low. You may have issues with policies in other agencies. But if you oppose the rule, which is effectively preventing this bill from moving forward, and if you oppose the passage of this bill, you are enabling the failed defense policies of this administration and accelerating the downward trajectory of our nation's security. It's very simple. It's very obvious. And I don't envy the person that votes against the rule or votes against this bill when they have to explain to their constituents and, more importantly, to our troops why they did not support this bill. We shouldn't play games or try to leverage this one, folks. We need to adopt a mentality of one team and one fight. We must decouple our efforts to provide meaningful support for our troops from negotiations on other fronts and pass this bill with amendments as necessary. If you want to change it, bring those changes forward and let's debate them. And we must do so on time. The threats are numerous, but the existential threat is China, and Chairman Xi is watching us very closely. Before I hand the mic off to Chairman Calvert, and we'll take questions at the end, folks, I'll stay here as long as you'd like. I want to talk about a very important part of this bill that I personally was vested in. And we buy all the submarines and the F-35s and the ships and the bullets that we need to buy, but the most important weapon is our troops. And in this bill, we take the starting salary from $22,000 a year for an E1. It's hard to believe, but that's what an E1, when you first join the military, you're making $22,000 a year, which is the equivalent of $11 per hour, which is about half of what a fast food worker makes in California right now. I rewrote the pay table so that they start at $31,200, which is the equivalent of $15 an hour. And this would be the biggest pay raise that we have given our junior enlisted troops. By the way, this doesn't ripple all the way up through the officer ranks. This is contained in the E1 through E6 ranks. But it represents a 35 to 40% increase at each one of those pay grades, which is absolutely necessary right now given where our troops are. About a third of our troops live below the poverty line. About a third of our troops qualify for food stamps. So if we're going to pay them in the form of food stamps, we might as well pivot that money to pay them in the form of base salary. I find it offensive and egregious that the president, Joe Biden, sent a veto letter out a few days ago where he cites this pay raise for our junior enlisted troops as one of the reasons that he's vetoing the DOD House Republican bill. I don't understand the logic of that. I don't know where Secretary of Defense Austin is, but if he's not talking to the president about this, he needs to be right now. These are echoes of similar sentiments from organizations like the Military Officers Association of America, which has not been supportive of my pay raise at the levels that they need to. By the way, I canceled my membership this morning with them because of this. We shouldn't wait. They're saying we need to wait for these studies to be concluded to figure out the right level of pay. But this bill does what's right. This bill gets our troops above the poverty line, and it's absolutely necessary. I want to also talk about Senator Tuberville. I've got friends right now who are classmates at the Naval Academy, good officers, good leaders, and this is a problem that's affecting all branches right now who are deciding whether to stay in or get out of the military. They are 06s in the Navy. That's a captain. They've been asked to, apply to be an admiral as an 07, and when they get accepted, they move, but they can't get the costs for those moves reimbursed right now. They're not getting paid as admirals until this Tuberville thing is resolved. This is not the right way to get an issue resolved. And while I understand what he's trying to do, what he's actually doing is hurting our military readiness levels right now. And I've requested a meeting with Senator Tuberville. I haven't yet gotten a response from him. But we absolutely have to have these issues and these debates here on the Hill and not use senior officers. He had mentioned that these are not officers who are war fighters, that these are desk jockeys in the Pentagon. But the reality is these folks have been war fighters for 20 years. These are the folks that I flew with in combat operations, and they're looking to continue that service, and they're being compelled not to because of Senator Tuberville. So with that, I'd like to hand over to my friend, colleague, and leader of the Defense Subcommittee and Appropriations, Mr. Ken Calvert from California, who has been absolutely instrumental in making sure this bill gets across the goal line. So, Ken, thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for putting together this important press conference. The U.S. military is not a petri dish of experimentation for social change. Our military must focus on near-term threats, delivery of capability, and taking care of our service members. Any policy that jeopardizes readiness, was divisive to our troops, and undermined the unit cohesion, or compromised the safety of our troops was removed in this bill. Right now, we need to focus on avoiding a government shutdown, which would be devastating to our military. A shutdown would put our military on a back foot against China, exactly the wrong moment. Critical procurements, including the Columbia and Virginia-class submarines, conventional prompt strike, the national security space launch would be prohibited. Necessary investments in programs like the B-21 and in the weapons industrial base, including the Trident, the Tomahawk, the Standard Missile, LASM, AMRAAM, would not occur. Small businesses will be severely impacted as orders and payments are delayed, stifling future innovation. The largest enterprise in the world would grind to a halt. The overwhelming majority of the department's civilian workforce would be furloughed in a shutdown, shutting down critical functions. Military readiness will be degraded as all exercises and training, live and virtual, will be deferred or canceled. Professional military education, proficiency, and qualification training will be canceled. Furthermore, maintenance and repairs to hardware and infrastructure would not be permitted, further delaying restoration of readiness levels following a shutdown. Our service members and their families are the ones who would bear the brunt of a shutdown. They would not get paid during the shutdown, but would be required to report to their duty station regardless. While at work, they will not be able to train, as I previously discussed, and at the same time, their access to essential family services, such as child care, medical appointments, and youth programs, would be severely limited. This is an untenable situation for our service members and their families. So we need to work together to get this done, and I'm glad this news conference is here to relay this message. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, yeah, and a little fact that most people aren't aware is that when we're in a CR, it actually effectively behaves like a $2 billion a week tax on our DoD budgets. That's loss of efficiencies, stops new programs from going forward, and that effectively looks like $2 billion a week of inefficiencies realized. I want to next recognize my good friend, shipmate from Wisconsin, who recently, unfortunately, lost his beautiful daughter in a fight to cancer. And despite the need to be home right now with his family, has chosen to be here today to fight for our troops. He sits on the Agricultural Committee. You guys know he's a retired Navy SEAL and someone who I have great respect for, Mr. Derek Van Orden. Thank you, Derek.
Thanks, Mike. Just going to cut to the chase. The world is a much more dangerous place under the Biden administration. We have an ascendant China. We're closer to World War than we have been, since what, 1962? Since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We need to make sure that we understand that our troops are not bargaining chips. They're not poker chips. These are real human beings that every day right now, as we're having this press conference, are out there protecting our lives. Those are ours and those are yours. And those are your children and they're my grandchildren. So we cannot use our troops as bargaining chips. We're all trying to get to the same place. We want fiscal responsibility. We want all of these things, reduce government spending. We want these things, but we got to do it responsibly. And this is not the way to do it. It simply is not. So collectively, we got to understand, if we don't act appropriately, if we don't act judiciously, and if we don't act rapidly, we will be shutting down the United States military, which will further exacerbate the problems that we're having throughout the world. And I got to tell you, Mike said about the pay. My wife and I, we had 4 children when I was an enlisted Navy SEAL, and we were on WIC. So we used government programs to help feed my children as I was literally being shot at as a Navy SEAL in combat. And that's just not okay. So to hold up someone's pay who is already essentially on welfare, who is risking their lives on a daily basis, I don't know how you could look at yourself in the mirror and shave. It's unconscionable to me. So I'm calling on the people in my party and the other party who are refusing to get on board with this bill. I'm calling on them to really think, reflect for a long period of time about what they're doing. And if that's not helping, I'd be more than happy to get on a plane with any one of them and fly to one of these conflict zones and show them the way that these folks are living. That is an open offer. You pick your continent, you pick your conflict. You want to walk out of that building with me and get on a plane? I mean, Mike could fly us there, or Rich. And I'll take you there, and I'll show you what you're mucking about with. So stop it. Get on board. Let's get this through, and let's make sure that our troops have what they need to protect our lives. That is all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thanks. All right, I would fly you there probably faster than Mr. McCormick would get you there, so we'll go with me. So up next, I do want to introduce a friend from Georgia, former Navy guy as well, also in the Marines for 20 years, sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee, a doctor, a pilot, and a great gentleman, a true patriot, Mr. Rich McCormick.
In the Marine Corps, before an officer goes on liberty, the enlisted goes on liberty. Before an officer gets paid, the enlisted gets paid. Before an officer eats, the enlisted eats. The reason we're doing this huge pay increase for the junior enlisted is because, quite frankly, they can't subsist on the pay that they get right now. And a lot of people actually get married so they can get extra bonuses and live off base and actually feel like real human beings. This is a very good thing. We've done a lot of good things in the NDAA. I'm very proud of the work we've done to serve the people who have been serving us, the people who would give their lives for everyone filming us right now. What a travesty it would be if we don't get this across the line, to serve them first. You've seen the problems we have with the VA. You've seen the problems we've had with PTSD and suicide, depression, anxiety, coping with even moving away from your family, which really for a lot of us is the military. It's time to do the right thing. I understand we have some things to work out inside of our own political family, but that's nothing compared to the things that we need to do to serve our military. The last meritocracy, the people who would give their lives, go overseas, spend months and years away from their family, give their limbs, have traumatic brain injuries, see their friends ripped from their arms during war, just to serve a greater cause, this great nation that we think is different than every other nation. So I'm just here to support my fellow veterans, our fellow Americans, and get something done for the people so we can preserve the American dream for everyone. Thank you, and Semper Fi.
Thanks, Rich. Appreciate you. And last but not least, another shipmate, good friend, one of the smartest men on the Hill, former submariner. We don't hold that against him, but from New York, Mr. Brandon Williams sits on the T&I and SST, as well as Education and Workforce Committees. Thank you, Brandon, for being here.
Great. Thanks, Mike. It's an honor to be here. I'm the first nuclear submarine veteran to serve in Congress in 50 years. It's my Dolphins, if you've never seen them before, the submarine warfare pin. And I'm also the first member of Congress ever to wear the Strategic Deterrent Patrol pin. I was the strategic missile officer on a Trident submarine, and I'm very proud to represent Central New York in Congress today. My colleagues have really given a lot of insight into the crisis that we're facing here in Washington and not supporting our troops that are in the field. I just want to point our attention to the submarine fleet for a moment. Submarines are number one in stealth. They're number one in firepower. Therefore, they are number one in deterrence. We are at the moment of facing this near-peer adversary. It's in the Pacific. The Pacific is a battle of the ocean, and we own and dominate everything that happens under the sea. To interrupt the funding and supply of the construction of our Columbia-class submarines and next-generation Virginia-class submarines is to do China a great disservice. The last time I was in China was May of 1989. In Tiananmen Square, just 2 or 3 weeks before Gorbachev was there. I was there as part of a school trip, ironically. Saw the protests there. This is a government that has to repress its own people. The reason China has such a large standing army is because they're afraid of their own people. If leadership in the United States fails, we will invite aggression. Deterrence is cheaper than war. No one is doing this better than our submarine sailors with respect to all the fine people who serve. We can't fumble at this critical juncture. We can't fumble in our construction of the platforms that we need to deter war, and we can't stumble in support of the people that we have out serving. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mike, for calling this, and appreciate you turning out for this important issue.
Thank you, Brent. Appreciate you. Yeah, if you've never seen the quality of life of submariners, I recommend you get that experience if you ever get an opportunity. I spent 5 years, 1 month on a submarine as a midshipman. So at this time, happy to take any and all questions that you guys have. Let's go left to right. Yes, sir.
If the Freedom Caucus doesn't do that, are you willing to work with Democrats to address some of the policy concerns they have in passing on a bipartisan basis?
Yeah, I think the focus right now is helping the Freedom Caucus understand the imperative of passing this. Any compromises or negotiations on the heels of passage on this should be addressed in the future. I can tell you right now, having sat on the markup process through the Appropriations Committee for this, there is a wide gap between where Democrats and Republicans are relative to funding our military. If the Democrats had their way, they would be jeopardizing our military readiness, lowering military pay relative to what I've proposed here, and effectively putting us in a more perilous position relative to China. So, look, I'm happy to negotiate with anyone at any time who's willing to do the right thing for our troops. We tried to do that in the Appropriations Committee. It would be an amazing coincidence if at this point they came to the table and we're in a position that was, in my opinion, commensurate with the need of our troops right now that we're pushing. So, yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for your time, gentlemen. This week, Secretary Kendall expressed a lot of frustration and concern regarding the possibility of a CR, especially and shutdown, especially a CR that would happen or last past December this year. I was just hoping maybe I could get your reactions to those frustrations and concerns, and maybe also if you could discuss how you're working with both the department to mitigate any challenges that would arise, and also internally with appropriations as well. Yeah,
so first of all, I do, like I said, I have a lot of respect for Secretary Kendall. He's been in this world for a long time. He's been in the Pentagon, but multiple branches of service as well, exposure to. And he's right on. This CR is a very dangerous notion. The fact that you can hit pause, not just on new programs, but also you relinquish any sort of concurrency benefits you get with other programs. The industrial base can no longer assume that the contracts are coming, so they start behaving differently, turning programs off, not buying material ahead of need. And as you've heard the president say on the international stage, unfortunately, we are way under our replenishment levels on weapon systems. So, like I said, it's about a $2 billion hit per week on the DoD budgets when we don't have an approved budget. I want to remind people that we have a rule in place that forces us to go 1% decrement relative to last year's budget, which is going to behave and cut very deeply in the next year if we stay on a CR for very long. And I also want to remind my Republican conservative colleagues that we also default back to the policies of Nancy Pelosi and the Biden administration when we operate under a CR, rather than moving towards the policies that we have, which are very good policies that go to the warfighter to deter and win the war, like I said. So the CR is not a good thing. It's not good for Democrats. It's not good for Republicans, and it sure as hell is not good for the warfighter. And I'm grateful that Secretary Kendall is being so vocal about this. I want Secretary of Defense to be as vocal and to be as strong a supporter of our troops that Mr. Kendall has been. Sure.
Yeah, so Congressman Matt Gaetz on the House floor this week threatened to oust Speaker McCarthy, seemingly upset with the spending levels not being low enough to what the Freedom Caucus would like to see. Are you concerned that could be a distraction, especially considering you guys have less than, 2 weeks to pass these appropriation bills?
Yeah, I think, like I said, one of our biggest weaknesses as humans, is, especially on the Hill, is people get too distracted too easily, right? And so the point of this here is to focus on the DOD bill. I will say that Speaker McCarthy, having been in this position for 9 months, and our conference has been underestimated, right? We have gotten more done in these 9 months than the Democrats have gotten in the last 4 or 5 years, and that the metrics show that. We're bending the arc of national security here at all levels, and this DOD bill is one of the biggest things. And if someone, I wasn't happy with the rule. I think this motion to vacate rule was like handing 220 matches out to your close friends, and then dousing yourself with gasoline as the Speaker of the House, and you're just waiting on the good faith of them to not do that. Where I come from, when you have someone who's in a position of leadership, you don't threaten to fire them every day because you're not happy with something they did one day or the next, right? The Speaker is in the arena. Now, I think if someone is in a very passionate position and they think this is a necessary thing to do, then they should have the courage to do it and not threaten to do it over and over again. That's not helping us move forward. That's not helping us with this very conservative agenda, especially this DOD bill, which is one of the most conservative bills we've seen in our nation's history. So I'm reminded of that line in Tombstone where Wyatt Earp is faced with a bad guy who's threatening to shoot him, and he tells him, "Hey, are you just going to stand there and bleed, or are you going to skin that smoke wagon and go to work?" Right? So stop the chatter, stop the rhetoric, stop the threats. If you're going to put a motion to vacate, do it, but recognize that this is not an easy job. This is not a thick majority. We have a 5-seat majority right now, that even that is getting thinner right now. So we've got to come together as one team, recognize the one fight, and the true adversary here is China. Yes, ma'am.
Should the Speaker just force a vote on the DOD bill next week and put these conservatives on the record?
Well, I think it's early to say that. I can tell you that I personally... What's that?
Would you want him to?
I'll get there. I am personally staying here this weekend, and I know several of us are, because I don't feel good going home knowing that there's an active negotiation. We haven't given up on the members of our party, and I never will. Right? I actually have a lot of faith in the members of our party. We are negotiating in good faith. I think we all want to do the same things and the right things for our country. We have different styles and tactics that we employ to get there. And so I don't condemn people who are trying to negotiate right now. I just want them to understand the imperative of getting on board here. Now after the next 72 hours, 96 hours, however many it ends up being, if we can't get people on board, I think we owe it to our troops to bring the floor to a vote. I'm not in leadership. I'll defer that decision to the leader, the whip, the speaker. But I think the American people deserve to know who is either on board or not on board with this DOD spending bill at some point. But I have faith in our shipmates here and in our conference that we're all going to get on the same page for the right reasons here shortly.
Congressman Garcia, you said you requested a meeting with Senator Tuberville. I wanted to ask the other members here if you have also requested a meeting or have any interest.
Well, let's be clear. When I was talking about the Tuberville issue, I was speaking on behalf of myself. So that's where I am on this position. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else. If you guys want to address it, you're more than welcome to.
I sat down with Senator Tuberville about 2.5 months ago. A friend of mine and colleague from my service in the Navy and from when we were classmates at Nuclear Power School is set to take over command of the submarine force. And he's an excellent candidate and deserves to get in that position and deserves to provide the leadership that we need, particularly at this critical time in this critical way. And so I went and sat in Senator Tuberville's office for about 45 minutes until he had an opening and would see me. And we had a very frank conversation about it. At the time, I was led to believe that it wouldn't last much longer, and here we are 2.5 months later, and we certainly don't seem to be any closer. So I'd like to see us get the leadership in place that we need, to face the threats that we face. That's a real story. I've not reported that before.
I want to back up just a minute here and talk about accountability. Everybody complains there's no accountability in government. So if this does not go as we would prefer to do so, I would like people to hold individuals accountable, because this will not be the Republican Party of the House of Representatives or the Democratic Party of the House of Representatives that holds us up. There will be some individuals from those parties that do so. And you can't, on one side of your face, saying we want the government to be accountable, and then the other side expect for you not to be accountable. So I would hope that you do that. And to put things into perspective, we understand that we are sailing an aircraft carrier. We are not driving a motorcycle. And it takes a long time to turn that ship, and it's going to take a long time to turn this ship around. But that's what we're here to do. So government officials such as ourselves and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle need to be held individually accountable, not the party, and we need to do this in the appropriate manner.
Well, thanks for the aircraft carrier metaphor, Derek, as
I
well.
throw that out there,
appreciate
please.
that. I would also say that we, the people, right, our constituents have a responsibility. Call your member of Congress, regardless of what party they're in, and talk about how important this is and the need to support our troops. So, yes, ma'am.
As you alluded to, there are some negotiations going on about potential what a CR might look like. I don't know if there's negotiations about bringing the bill to the floor. How do you feel those are going? And what do you think the potential is to have this bill next week, as well as some CR that addresses some of the issues you mentioned about military contracts, et cetera?
Yeah, well, look, hey, I'm always confident in our ability to get there, right? The timing may not be ideal, as we saw with the speakership nomination, but I do encourage us as a party to get together in one room. I was hopeful that we could do that. I think we are going to be doing that early next week to hash through this, to look at all the strategies. I'll defer to leadership on how this is all going to be packaged up. I would submit that the more things that we can get a la carte, the better, so that we can have up-down votes on the issues and not necessarily on packages that, frankly, gather more and more antibodies. But to get back to the point of this bill, this DOD bill specifically should be addressed by itself on its own merits, allow for debate and the amendments to come forward like our rules require us to. And then at least get this one off. This represents 60-70% of our discretionary spending. So this is a big chunk of what we're trying to accomplish with the spending bills. As far as CR, I think it's self-evident that we're going to be in a CR if we do our jobs correctly. A shutdown is probably the worst thing that we could do for the country. And we need to do everything we can to avoid that. But a 30 to 45, 60-day CR to give us that negotiation space. And I want to remind Americans that this whole process starts with the president's budget request, which came to us very late this year. So while we all hold accountability for timeliness, we were behind the 8 ball, so to speak, from the outset because of the president's budget request. It was 6 weeks late. So that's not to pass the buck, but there's a lot of accountability here. But the CR will give us some maneuvering space to negotiate this. So, yes, sir.
Congressman, with Ukrainian President Zelensky expected to be in Washington next week, it's going to bring Ukrainian funding issue back to the fore. What's your sense for how the administration's request for more, $24 billion more for Ukraine, how is that going to fare? How is that faring in the House? Are Republicans divided on this? Is it going to be a heavy lift to get it done in the coming weeks?
Yeah, well, I don't necessarily know where Republicans are because we don't necessarily know what the president's asking for right now, right? Look, I'll be very clear. I supported the initial tranche of $40 billion in support to the Ukrainians. With that, the nation of Ukraine is still in existence a year and a half later. Zelensky's still alive. They've clawed back much of the Donbas and Donetsk regions. We've gotten an ROI for that investment, which wasn't just cash on pallets like the Iranian nuclear deal was. It was actually weapon systems that were going to expire that were actually made for those Russian targets, right? Those Stingers were made for those Hind helicopters. Those Javelin missiles were made for those T-72 tanks. And this was an opportunity to put those weapon systems in Ukrainian hands take down a peer threat in the form of Russia in a 1.5-year time frame, kill a lot of Russians without putting an American in harm's way. That's a great ROI. The problem we have right now is when you ask the average American, how's the war in Ukraine going right now, they can't tell you. And if you ask the average member of Congress how the war in Ukraine is going, they can't tell you either. And that's not because we're not trying to find out. We get classified briefs and we get somewhat of an update. But the reality is that the President of the United States has a responsibility to come to the American people and say, hey, if we are going to invest $100 billion of American taxpayer dollars, here's what we are doing and here's why it is so important. And here's the accountability. We've been asking for oversight and accountability reports from the Ukrainian Congress on how this money has been implemented, where the weapon systems are, to make sure that they're not getting in the wrong hands, that there's not laundering going on. And we haven't gotten that feedback from Zelensky in his parliament. Look, I'm not necessarily opposed to supporting the Ukrainians further, but I am opposed to doing it at this point without some sort of explanation from the executive branch, Secretary of Defense Austin, telling us what we are doing with this money and where it's going and what the end state is. It's as if this White House has forgotten what the Weinberger Doctrine is, and even though we don't have troops there, we have $100 billion investment there that does matter, and we're not in great shape on the national security front ourselves, right? We have an open border to the south. We're losing this race with China right now, and that threat seems to be more imminent than ever. And he's coming, the president's coming to us for more help on Ukraine when he's telling me in a letter that he doesn't support giving our troops a pay raise that they needed in 1982. That's absurd, right? So answer the questions, tell us what you're doing with the money, and let's have a debate on the floor about this funding and not ramming it down our throat. We can't give a blank check to the executive branch. It's like having your 16-year-old kid ask for gas money every 2 hours when he's not even driving his car. We need to know what the money is going, how we're using it, and what we need to do forward.
Just a quick point, Mike. The first priority we have is to pass a defense appropriation. Before we really get into discussion about a potential supplemental, we need to pass a defense appropriation. That's our first priority. And so if leadership knows that, that's the path we're taking, at least here in the House, and that's our first priority. And I just want to make one point on this defense appropriation. The United States military shouldn't be held hostage to procedural votes. We need to get this done, and we need to get this done next week.
All right, any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the White House opposing the defense appropriations bill as it's written. If and when this does get through the House, what would you anticipate a situation where the conference could be Senate or negotiations on that looking like? How much are you concerned that you guys put in there that you're saying is help for the military?
Yeah. Those conversations would be good to have. We got to get this bill through the House. We've got to look at every issue that the president has. We've got to look at what the Senate's trying to do. Look, while China is the threat, and this DoD bill does makes a very critical step towards securing us against China. The other existential threat we have is our debt and our inflation, right? The average American's getting crushed right now by those things, and we are trying to rein in the spending. So one of the challenges is that the Senate, has not adopted the paradigm that House Republicans have, which is we need to cut spending that doesn't provide directly to our national security like Homeland, DoD, VA do. So. But we've got to get a seat at the table and have those negotiations and get the president to understand the value proposition of this DoD bill. And we can't do that if we don't pass the defense spending bill in the House. All right, guys, without any other questions, appreciate you all coming here today, and look forward to these discussions next week as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Good job.